Hi everyone, I'm Susan Birch and welcome back to the 5th season of the Health Detective podcast. I can't believe that I'm in this 5th season and I'm looking forward to bringing you some amazing guests this year. And I wanted to start the year with a big bang, and I know from all the emails and messages I get dealing with the change of life, which is a very hot topic for so many women. I saw my mum and my mum-in-law suffer through hot flushes, weight gain, poor sleep for many years. And that was one of the combinations of things that got me really interested in learning about all aspects of health. It looked like a really miserable time, and I was pretty convinced that I didn't want to go through all of that. So one of the research papers I conducted for my nutrition degree was on menopause. I've had a few guests on the podcast talking about this topic from quite a few different perspectives over the last couple of years, but the questions keep pouring in from the listeners, and I've got many of my own that come from trying to help women through this phase of life. And this is why I reached out to my friend and previous podcast host, Dr Estrelita van Rensburg. I love Estrelita's approach to this topic, and who better is there to explain what's going on and why. So today, Estrelita will start by redefining or renaming menopause for us to set the stage for the conversation we need to have about the underlying root causes. So Estrelita, thanks so much for joining me again. And I'm looking forward to a wonderful discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Sue. It's really a pleasure to be back on your podcast series. It's always enjoyable. You're such a good host. And I think you're such a great facilitator to help people, express what they think and what they know. And I'm sure that your clients really appreciate all these information sessions that you make available to them. So thanks for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. Well, let's get into it, the hot topic. Menopause. Yes. What is menopause? How do we define it? And I'm going to let you take it away, Estrelita, and I will come in with questions and clarifications when I need to. And I know you would like me to share some slides, so please just let me know when you want me to do that.
Yeah, great. So thanks a lot. So I want to start to say that, I became interested in nutrition over the last 5 to 7 years. I'm a medical doctor by qualification. I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for many years. And I had really the traditional views that the majority of medics out there have, as well as nutritionists, about what is healthy and what is not. But I slowly started changing my mind when I personally started researching nutrition as a subject that's not very well covered at medical school. And as you can see from all the books behind me, it's been quite a journey. And what I've discovered, it really galvanized me into speaking to people and say, look, there's such a lot of misinformation, and it's driving chronic illness, globally. So over the last 2 years, my feelings has changed a lot about menopause as I got deeper into this subject. And I want to propose something radically different today to the listeners, that the menopause, as it's defined by society in the West and so on, is actually a different disease, and that the way menopause has been handled and treated is not really effective. And I think a lot of women on treatment, on HRTs and so on, will agree with that's not really the end result that they were hoping for. So it's going to be a bit of a wide-ranging topic today, because I need to dig into various aspects, even history and evolution and so on, to make people understand why I came to the conclusion that menopause is a very different disease. So I would like to start, and please interrupt, Sue, when you need to. I read a very interesting book over the last 3 months, and the name of the book is, or the title is, The Slow Moon Climbs. And the author is Susan Birch. I'll spell it, it's Mattern. This book was published in 2019, and Susan Birch is a professor of ancient history in the US, and she also studies the history of diseases. And this book specifically looks at menopause through the ages. Very interesting. But I will just mention one or two of the things from this book. And the first thing that really struck me is that she said, in humans, we have a very long post-reproductive lifestyle stage, as we know. When we lose our fertility as women, we can live for many, many decades. We know that. But what she says is this is not very common in other animal species. In fact, there are only 3 mammals that's got this long post-reproductive lifestyle stage. So the first is women. The other 2, very interesting, is not land mammals. These are sea mammals, and it's the orca and the short fin pilot whale.
Oh.
And they have very long post-reproductive life stage, also decades, just like humans. But even our closest relative, the chimps, don't have that. They can reproduce up to the age of 50 years, but that's also the end of their lifespan. So something happened. Why, in an evolutionary perspective, did we as humans develop in this way that we have this long life stage? Now, very interestingly, we know from various studies on orcas and so on, that it's actually the older females that are the leaders of these whale pods, and they're very important for the survival of the pod and the youngest. They teach them what to do, so to speak. So there seems to be a very important reason why these females survive that long. And that brings me back, and this is also very well covered in this book, The Slow Moon Climbs, about traditional societies, which anthropologists have studied specifically in the 20th century, when there were still pockets left globally. I'm thinking about the Native American tribes. I'm thinking about the Mayan tribes of Central America and Guatemala, the Maoris in New Zealand, the Aborigines in Australia, and some of the traditional societies in Africa, like the Hadza. And what the anthropologists found is that the postmenopausal women were very important members of their societies. They had very important functions to do. They helped the younger women. They helped with the raising of the children. And when they were specifically asked about this stage, medical symptoms, disease, hot flushes, all the kind of things that Western women typically experience, they didn't know what they were talking about. To them, it was only a progression of a reproductive phase in life to a non-reproductive phase. But it wasn't associated with any symptoms, really. Most of them didn't have any words describing hot flushes, for instance. So they were seen in the tribe as the wise women, the helpers, the guides, very important functions. We don't have that in Western society. And I will get back to this point when we start discussing HRT at the end of the podcast, because it's very important to be aware of this distinction.
Estrelita, can I just ask a question there? And this might seem a bit naive, But, you know, before we begin menstruating, you know, we have these sex hormones are low in us. We have low estrogen, and we're not suffering from hot flushes and weight gain and mood disorders. So I do sometimes wonder what's the difference at the end of our life when we go back to that state of having low hormones, that suddenly these become
Well,
so
excellent
chronic.
point. You know, I haven't even thought about that, but that's a very interesting point that we can add to this discussion. Because that's exactly right. And I'll come to a slide where we go through the different life stages, and we can get back to that. Maybe just something that I forgot to mention is, I think having seen what happens in whale species and so on, and in humans, I think evolutionary, this developed in humans because to help with the raise of infants and children, because as we know in humans, the phase is very long. It can take more than a decade to 2 decades for children and young adults to mature. And it makes sense when you look at what happens in orca pods, that the mother needs help, or the society needs help with the raising. So that's just another point that I wanted to make. But I think this brings us maybe, Sue, to a good point to start looking at the physiology, because we need to have some basic information about that to understand that what I'm going to propose, the real diseases. So if you can bring up the slides, the first slide, just to give a perspective on, yeah, that's a good slide. And I want to start here because we need to understand, I think from a postmenopausal perspective, we think just about female sex hormones and it's low and so on, but it's not just that. It's much more complicated like that. We've got a metabolism that's driven by hormones, and we've got our reproductive system that's also driven by a different set of hormones. But the two systems are actually interlinked. So what that means is, if we have problems in our metabolic health, it's going to impact our reproductive health. So the one can't function without the other. They are integrated. And that's what I want to just briefly explain in the next slide, if you can move to that. I know it's a little bit of a more busy slide, but I think we need this to understand what's going on. So on the left-hand side of the slide in blue, that's basically our reproductive system. And if we look at the right-hand side in this orangey red color, that's our metabolic side. So I'm going to start on the left side, and it all starts in our brain, the reproductive hormones. And you will see that at the top there, the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, that's the first hormone that's secreted in our brain, activating our reproductive hormones. Then that activates two hormones, LH and FSH. People don't have to remember all of this. And those hormones directly impact our gonads. And it's the same for men and women. In men, it's impact on the testes, and women in the ovaria. And it stimulates the secretion of estrogens and progesterones for women, and testosterone in men. So that's usually the only way that we think about reproduction. But we miss the most important part, and that is the hormone on the right-hand side. And it's written in capital letters for a reason, big insulin. Insulin, we know that insulin is the fat storage hormone, and it's important for bringing our blood glucose down. Those are very important functions of insulin. But insulin has got other functions as well. It's very important during pregnancy, because insulin is what we call an anabolic hormone, means it stimulates growth. And in pregnancy, it stimulates the growth of the placenta, of the breast tissue, And it also stimulates the growth of fat deposits in the mother. And that's very important because the fat provides energy for the growing fetus and placenta, and also for all the functions that the mother's body need to do to support the pregnancy. Now, when insulin levels are normal, when our metabolism is normal, everything goes according to plan. But the problem starts when insulin levels goes into the abnormal range. And it's usually a high range, high insulin levels that start impacting our reproductive functions negatively. Now, the next question is, what raises insulin? Insulin responds to the type of food that we eat. And the high levels of insulin is associated with the consumption of carbohydrates. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. That's maybe for another discussion, but that's what makes insulin high. So what does high insulin do with regard to our reproductive system? Well, it impacts in women, our ovaria directly, because it impacts an enzyme in our ovaria called aromatase. And aromatase is the enzyme that's responsible for the production of estrogens, but it decreases the function of that enzyme. So what happens? Our estrogen values fall, levels fall. And there's a consequence for that. In fertile women, it means that they can't ovulate, so those egg cells can't be released. They're retained in the ovaria. Ultimately, if this condition carries on, women become infertile, and the condition is called polycystic ovary syndrome. But the same kind of thing also happens in men, because high insulin levels will negatively impact the production of testosterone in the testes. What happens in men? Their testosterone levels fall, their sperm production falls, they become infertile, and they frequently develop erectile dysfunction. So we can see that actually the conductor of this orchestra of hormones is insulin, and not primarily the hormones in the reproductive phase. They are subservient to insulin. If insulin is out of kilter, your reproduction is not going to work normally. The last, yep.
Sorry, I was just going to say, we're seeing so much more of this in men, you know, so much more aromatase activity, low testosterone, highest rates of, you know, low sperm count ever. And now, you know, they're talking about the andropause in men, you know, the male menopause. And, you know, I've got lots of men contacting me saying, you know, what cause of my male menopause. So
exactly. So, and this is what's happening now. You know, they started in the 20th century giving women HRTs to up their sex hormones. The same thing is now starting in men, and we'll come to that, I think, in the next slide. Why men? Because men and women suffer from the same thing here: low sex hormones and infertility issues. It's becoming an epidemic. And we'll talk about why that is so. The last thing I just want to quickly mention is leptin. As insulin rises, leptin rises. Leptin is a hormone secreted by our fat cells, and it means it's a feeling full hormone, as we can say today. But leptin also stimulates the production of sex hormones by activating the hormones in the brain. That's another cycle, and there's a lot of impact on that. Maybe that's something that can be discussed later, but this is the picture that we need to keep in mind for the rest of the discussion. So if you can move to the next slide. And I think this slide is central. We've spoken through about the different life stages in a woman's life. And if we look at the age when the typical menopausal symptoms arise, it's usually between 40 to 60 years. I think it's actually becoming sooner, and more people, people talk about perimenopause in their 30s and late 30s and so on. What's going on? So we all already know there's a hormonal imbalance because the doctors prescribe sex hormones to treat these symptoms. But there's something that we forget, and that there's another condition that actually coincides exactly at the same time point, and it's called insulin resistance. And this is because the hormone insulin is not functioning correctly any longer. It's also a hormonal imbalance, and we've seen in the previous slide what happens when insulin values go high. We call that hyperinsulinemia, and that is driven by our diet, the food that we eat. If we, over a long time period, eat a high carbohydrate diet, most people become insulin resistant. It's a condition that's not diagnosed, very seldom diagnosed. Doctors usually don't know how to diagnose it. It's a kind of a silent disease because insulin resistance is a precursor disease to many of the conditions that we see these days. Type 2 diabetes, obesity levels, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, and many more conditions. And this is not associated with this condition. So it's like pre-diabetes, pre-Alzheimer, that's been in our bodies, this metabolic abnormality, for years and decades. Yet when people present with type 2 diabetes, they're all surprised, what happened here? All out of the blue. I'm now a type 2 diabetic. No, this is something that was there for a long time. But many women, unfortunately, this phase is labeled as menopause, even though menopause is a normal physiological process in the lifespan of a woman. Therefore, when we say it's physiological, it means it's normal. It's not supposed to be associated with any symptoms. And your point exactly about young children with same low estrogen and so on, why don't they have symptoms? Very good point there. But the second condition of insulin resistance is not a normal condition. This is a pathological condition. This is a condition associated with symptoms. What kind of symptoms? Well, here it goes. Mood changes, weight gain, especially in the abdominal area. You can't get rid of the weight. You're tired all the time. You just don't have the energy. You can't sleep at night. You're irritable. You're moody. Here we go. What am I discussing, Sue? I'm discussing the symptoms of menopause.
Yeah.
I speak to women on a daily basis. This is what they experience. They're tired. They're irritable. They better go to the doctor to give them hormones. Is that going to help? Okay, well, I'll just leave that question hanging there. And then the last point I want to make on this slide is that the interesting thing is, what are the symptoms that men suffer in this midlife phase? Mood swings, weight gain, irritability, low energy, depression. It's exactly.
Changes in body composition, all the same things.
Yes, low testosterone, erectile dysfunction, there we go. Exactly. The same condition happens in both men and women. So I'm going to move on a little bit off this, but I'll come back to the hormonal thing here, because we need to think very carefully how doctors and society see menopause, because the therapies that's offered to people in this that suffer from these symptoms are not helping them because it's the wrong therapy. But we'll get to that. So just before you put the next slide on, I'm coming back to the book that I started with, The Slow Moon Climbs, because Susan Matron actually looked in detail at historic literature to try to understand when did menopause, a condition of menopause, first appear in the literature of Western society. And she went back and she couldn't find anything before the 1700s. And then slowly during the 1700s, there were manuscripts. A lot of that actually, they spoke about women's issues, specifically around women's health and childbirth and so on. Not everything typically related to menopause, but as the years progressed in the 19th century and obviously the 20th century, this thing became full blast, described and getting the condition named as menopause and so on. But because we now understand that actually these symptoms are actually driven by insulin and not by the sex hormones, I decided to go back over the last 300 years and look at what changes happened with respect to a dietary impact in our globally and especially in the West that can explain why we see what we see today, which is really an epidemic of menopause or what you want to call it. So I've identified, and we can go to the next slide now, Sue, that I just want to talk about. I found 5 nutritional reasons why we see what we see. And I found, and the 6th reason is the hormone replacement and the pharma industry. But I'm quickly going to just talk through the 5 nutritional aspects that had a profound change on the food that we eat and our consumption as a human race. So we'll start. So on the left-hand side at the top here, and the first culprit that I identified here is the consumption of sugar. And the little graph here comes from our book, Eat Well or Die Slowly. And it's really to show that in the 1700s, there was very little consumption of sugar as we know it today. Around about 2 kilograms per year estimated per person. But we can see through the 18th and 19th century, the consumption escalated. So what are we talking about here? Where does sugar come from? Sugar comes from sugar cane. And we know about the production of sugar cane in the West Indies and the Caribbean. And the slave trade was responsible for being able to generate the production of sugar cane. Sugar cane was then transported back to England where sugar was refined from that. But also in addition to that, sugar beet started being grown in Europe, specifically in France in the mid-18th century. And that's also an important source of sugar. So we can see on this graph back here how the consumption of sugar increased after the UK abolished its tax on sugar. And then we see in the 20th century 2 little dips, which is explained by the 2 world wars, not so much consumption. That increased by the year 2000 to an amount of 80 kilograms per person per year. Now you just have to look at that. What is the carbohydrate load that modern humans need to contend with? It is massive. It is not something small. It's a complete change in our dietary composition. If we think back, you know, we've evolved as a species over 4 to 6 million years. And this is not the diet that our bodies evolved to be able to cope with. In fact, my whole argument in this slide is that our metabolism is completely overwhelmed by the load of carbohydrates that we're exposed to. Now, if we go to the next one at the bottom on the left, The next big event was the introduction of soft drinks, or Coca-Cola, the history of Coca-Cola, first produced by a pharmacist in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US in 1868. And the drink consists of, obviously, water, sweetness, and sugar. And today, the sugar that's used is high fructose corn syrup. That's the sugar that comes from corn these days. But I want you to have a look at this graph and see it. This graph is only from 1890 to just before the war. And it's the total amount of gallons of Coca-Cola syrup produced or sold worldwide. We see exactly the same graph that we saw in sugar. In fact, this is still, I only have the data up to the Second World War, but this is going further and further. So what we're seeing now is actually that it's this soft drink industry have a good idea about the consumption of their products. And you'll be surprised to hear that there's actually 2 billion servings of these soft drinks consumed every day globally. 2 billion servings. Now, let's think about it. Think about a can of Coca-Cola. It's about 330 milliliters in a typical can. The amount of sugar in one can of Coca-Cola or similar other soft drink is 9 teaspoons of sugar, just in one can. And that gives us an idea of the amount of sugar that's contained in these drinks. So similar pattern to sugar.
And I think it's really well worth mentioning that, you know, ideally we have 1 teaspoon of sugar circulating in our bloodstream at any time. And when it gets higher, we have to put that sugar somewhere. And once our liver glycogen stores are full and our muscle glycogen stores are full, the only place we can put it is using insulin, converting it to fat, triglycerides, and sticking it in our fat stores.
Exactly. And the other thing, what happens exactly as you say, is that when we eat extra carbohydrates or sugar, our insulin levels are high all the time. And that's what we're talking about. Abnormal insulin levels on a daily basis for years and decades. Our metabolism can't handle it. Okay, so we get the picture. I mean, in 2022, the yearly turnover of Coca-Cola was in the region of $500 billion. That just gives us an idea of how much of these kinds of drinks are consumed globally. Right, I think that's enough said about that one. Let's move on to number 3, which is in the top or in the middle. So you'll ask, what has farming got to do with any of this? Well, that's very interesting, because a lot changed after the Second World War. I mean, Second World War had huge munition factories globally that produced arms. And after the war, what was happening to these factories? You know, they produced chemicals and so on. Well, somebody got the bright idea, let's switch that over and put, you know, these factories, some of the munitions and stuff that they produce, very similar to pesticides and fertilizers used in munitions. Let's just put that into the farming industry. So there's a massive production of fertilizers, pesticides, and that drove the whole industrial farming complex, a system that's now operational. Now, it's interesting to see, because it changed farming completely. Small little farmers were pushed out. You know, there's a whole history about that. Big corporations coming in, producing tons and tons of this. So much so that we need to understand that about 4% of the available land mass globally is now producing crops. And there are three main crops. It's soybeans, wheat, and corn globally. Now, the environmental impact of this type of farming using these chemicals is immense, because it actually destroys the soil health. It promotes erosion. It kills off all the small little mammals, insects, bees, birds that was in that area. So millions and hundreds of thousands of species are going extinct because of this. But not only that, the fertilizers and pesticides go into the rain and go into our rivers, flowing off from the farms. It kills, these chemicals sterilizes our rivers and so on. It's not a place any longer for, like here in Scotland, salmon to use as their habitat and so on. So it's a massive input. And the rivers flow out in the estuaries into the sea, and it creates a dead sea zone. It impacts our marine life as well. So don't think that, you know, plant-based food and so on is the savior for the planet. It's got a huge, huge environmental impact that's really not talked about enough. But it produces these, the soy, the wheat, and the corn are carbohydrates. It's carbohydrate-rich food. And this is used by the food industry to produce processed foods and to make more sugar and so on. So it's also driving the same scenario as the two examples on the left, because it's now ubiquitous in all the processed food that we buy and eat, driving insulin levels once again higher and higher.
And I just want to make a comment about soy, because soy is promoted strongly to women suffering from menopause as, you know, being pro-estrogenic and helping them to maintain their estrogen levels. So a lot of women are using soy, hoping to support themselves through their menopause.
Yes, you're right. And soy is used as one of the plants by the pharmaceutical industry to produce estrogen, because you're right, the plant estrogen is very similar to the human one. But what we don't understand is, think about how ubiquitous soy is used in protein powders, in infant food, everything. Those children are exposed to higher levels of estrogen. Men are exposed to estrogen. No wonder, as an additional reason why their testosterone is not functioning so much, they've got too much estrogen. We see that puberty, especially in girls, is pushed. It's a younger and younger age for puberty, because these children are exposed to these products with estrogens. In 1800s, puberty for girls was usually around about 16 years. Now, puberty happens to girls 10 years or younger.
Yeah. And look, you know, Estrelita, we've known this for a long time. I mean, I remember, you know, when I was, you know, doing my master's degree, that I was reading research about this way back then, you know, the damaging effects of the soy estrogens on young boys. And, you know, the fact that you brought that up just reminds me that the populations of young boys then are now the men today who are really suffering from these low testosterone and other hormonal problems. So
absolutely. I mean, I know a retired doctor living close to where I live, and spoken to him about it one day, and he said, you know, he remembers how little baby girls wasn't breastfed but got bottle fed. obviously, and if you look what is in the constituents, what is it made, the milk made of, there's a lot of soy. He said he even had little baby girls starting menstruating because of the high estrogen levels. Now, this is absolutely shocking. So people should stop thinking that this plant-based diet is so good, because it actually impacts our metabolism, our hormones going haywire. And just to finish off with soy, it's got many toxins, and it's even got goitrogens. So it also suppresses thyroid function. Don't think it just stops with the female sex hormones. So that in itself is a different topic.
And also, you know, the glyphosate and then the impact on our gut health. So, you know, like you said, we could really go down the weeds there, and we won't. But, you know, we've really got to keep all those implications and effects in our minds when we're talking about this topic.
You see, what we're doing here is we're taking a 50,000-foot view on what happened over the last 300 years. And people don't think about this. You know, we're just too busy with our daily lives to think about the next meal and where we're going to get a quick fix. But we need to think about this because it is making us sick. Let's go to number 4, which is at the bottom. And this is the dietary guidelines. Now, this is just the Eat Well guide from the UK. And, you know, most countries have got something similar. And so where does this guidelines come from? Well, it was in America, in the Nixon administration. They wanted people to be healthy and not to have heart attacks. So they put together a committee that was going to advise the Americans what to eat so that they can stop all these heart attacks and heart disease. Now, this committee, and this is all documented, this is not in my imagination, was the committee members were slanted towards vegetarianism. And this is what they then proposed to the American Senate, that people should change the diet that they've been on for the last 3 million years, and that all of a sudden, animal fat and saturated fat was now the cause of heart disease. Let me just remind you, there were no, and still is no, verifiable scientific evidence for that. And people should start changing and eating more vegetables and fruit. And as you can see there, a lot of wheat products and oats and stuff like that, breakfast cereals and so on. Limit your exposure to saturated fat and animal meat, especially red meat. You can even see, if you, I mean, the picture is so small, but there's even a lot of junk food in that. So the proposal was that from a diet, you should eat 50 to 65% of your diet should now consist of carbohydrates. Now, we know that carbohydrates drive abnormal insulin levels, right? So now this was ratified by the US Senate in 1980, and boom, there the American public had to comply with that. And they did, because if you look at data, you can see how the diet changed. You know, people started eating more carbs, less meat, and there came the food industry to produce all these fat-free products and plant-based dairy products, blah, 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 all very high in carbohydrates. So this was adopted by most Western countries. And then actually, the food industry just filled that void with hundreds and hundreds of products made from high carbohydrates. So it's even governments and politicians were now telling people what to eat. No understanding about human metabolism or human health.
That's so frustrating. I've talked to our members of parliament, various members of parliament here in New Zealand about this. And I mean, they just shrug their shoulders and they just say, oh, well, we've got expert panels that yes, decide all this stuff. No, nobody is interested. No one wants the conversation.
And this is why individuals for themselves need to start thinking about their own health, because the government is not going to do it. Nowhere in the world. I'll move on to the top right, which is the last thing that I want to talk about, food specifically, and the changes, massive changes that we've seen. And this is the introduction of vegetable or seed oils, sometimes also called hydrogenated vegetable or seed oils. Now, where does this come from? So we're talking about things like rapeseed, safflower, sunflower, corn, soybeans. Actually, soybean oils are the most prevalent of these type of oils. And we have to go back to the Industrial Revolution, when a lot of machinery was produced, as we know, and these machinery needed lubricants to be able to function. And the lubricants used in those years were whale oil. So humans hunted whales, and they almost decimated the whale populations globally. So they had to look for another source to lubricate their machinery. And so that came from the cotton industry. And cotton seeds was a leftover product from cotton. And they started experimenting with that, pressing it to become an oil. But they had to do a lot of chemical modifications because it became rancid very quickly. It wasn't stable. So huge industry. It almost looks like a refinery if you see where these vegetable and seed oils are produced. And slowly, somebody started thinking, well, it looks like an oil. I mean, they've bleached it. It had a nice color. They could give it a color that was looking kind of good. Why don't we put it in the food chain? So they first started introducing it into butter to make it cheaper, the butter, without the public knowing about that. But the first big step really started in the beginning of the 20th century, when the big American corporation Procter & Gamble in 1911 introduced these vegetable seed oils and sold it as lard, completely different. And so once again, the advertising machinery took over and started convincing housewives that this was good to use in the cooking. And it soon found its way into processed food because it was cheap. So the people producing these food wanted to cut costs and put these oils in it. We all know about margarine and the big hype about margarine being heart healthy, blah, 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 change, stop the butter. This little graph that I've got there, one can see how over the 20th century, soybean use has escalated. This is just US data, and how butter use decreased. But I think one of the things that really stings in this history is in 1961, the American Heart Association actually started supporting the vegetable seed oil industry and told people to stop eating saturated fat, which was supposedly bad for your heart, and start eating these seed oils. And why? Because they got millions of dollars of funding from the manufacturers of these seed oils. So this was the Heart Association, you know, telling people to do, and people complied, right? Now, what we need to understand is that there have been randomized controlled trials performed by comparing people that's using vegetable and seed oils as compared to people that eat a more traditional diet for saturated fat from animal products. And then actually, if you compile all the data, it's involved over 70,000 men and women. And what was the outcome of the studies? First of all, there was no effect on heart disease or mortality in people that were eating saturated fat. No additional mortality. Secondly, the groups that actually ate the vegetable or seed oils, there were effects. First of all, increase in cancer twice compared to the other group. Gallstones, about 3 times the risk of having gallstones, and about twice the risk to have strokes. Now, we know that these vegetable and seed oils are highly inflammatory in the body. They are really poisoning us. Even if you go, I live in Edinburgh, if I go to a good restaurant here, most of them use vegetable and seed oils now. You have to ask. Some of them refuse to use butter. So you have to be very careful. Every time you buy a tin of processed food or something in a packet, it's probably that they've used vegetable or seed oils. But this is a poison for us.
I'm just going to jump in. For anyone who wants to know a bit more about that, I did a podcast with Chris Kenobi on that subject, and also with Tucker Goodrich. So they're both real experts in the about seed oil. So if you want to go and check those out, you can learn a lot more. And I did a summary of it all with Tian de Klerk last year in the Health Made Simple series. So I'll just direct you to those just to learn a lot more about seed oils and really reinforce what Estrelita is just explaining to us right now.
Good. So the last point on this slide is HRTs. And once again, this can be a very long discussion, but I'll just do a summary. And the image there is just to show, you know, how HRT therapy actually, how the usage of that is increasing. And this is a projection of usage until 2023. So this is supposedly the treatment for people, for women with menopausal symptoms that we know has got nothing to do with menopause per se. So estrogen, you know, just briefly, I love history, you probably have heard that, was first discovered in 1929. But the importance is by 1939, there were several products already on the market to be used for low estrogen. The first one, and I think most people know this, is Premarin. This actually comes from the urine of pregnant mares. It's still there. My mother was on it for her whole postmenopausal life. And she thought, because her gynae prescribed it, that it's absolutely number one thing that she had to take on a daily basis. Now, didn't help her, mind you. Anyway, the other thing, there was another synthetic estrogen that was produced also in 1939. It was called diethylstilbestrol. Now, some people may remember this because it had devastating impact on people that use this synthetic estrogen. And it specifically affected the children, the daughters of women that use this compound, because they developed an increased rate of cancer of the cervix, as well as pancreatic cancer and breast cancer. Obviously, diethylstilbestrol is no longer used. But bear in mind what happened there, because we know that the use of HRT, and I'll come to why there's been such an increased prevalence in the usage, has been astronomical. We're talking billions of dollars made by the pharma industry for producing these compounds. And they can come, as you've said, from using plants like soy to produce it. They make synthetic ones, and they still produce Premarin today. But I think there came a little shock to the community around about 2002, when the results of the Women's Health Initiative study were released, because they looked at HRT and they looked at risk factors compared to women that didn't use HRT. And what did they see? That there was a definite increase in risk for breast cancer, for stroke, for heart attacks, for uterine cancer, as well as pulmonary embolism. Now, these are all fatal conditions. This is serious. So this has been shown. And then there was a little dip in a lot of women decided not to use it. But I think if you look at today, women are just being told once again that it's okay to use it and going back there.
Well, I'm seeing many influencers on social media, including endocrinologists and obstetricians and gynecologists, saying that the women's health study has been, the data has been reviewed, and they've now come to a different conclusion. And I think there's something to do with how they integrate estrogen and progesterone together. And so now I see a really big push again for HRT. And I'm seeing, and I don't know if this is the right place to talk about this, Estrelita, because maybe we should talk about it later, but one of the things I am seeing amongst this push is, even for women like myself, so 65 now, I have had no menopause symptoms whatsoever, but it's been recommended to me that I should take HRT to protect my heart, to stop osteoporosis, to reduce my risk of Alzheimer's disease, reduce my risk of stroke. And, I just asked the question, why is my exercise and weight training not enough to help reduce my risk of osteoporosis? And why is my diet not enough to reduce my risk of Alzheimer's disease and stroke? But it's been really pushed once again.
Well, it reminds me, Sue, of what's happening with statins and cholesterol testing, that we know that cholesterol is not the culprit, but if you have a value, a little bit of a high value defined by the guidelines, you offered the statin because you're going to die if you don't take a statin. And we see the same kind of thing happening with HRTs. Women are told that these awful things are going to happen if they don't take it. And that's part of the marketing messages of the pharmaceutical industry. But this industry has also infiltrated the medical profession. This is what is taught in medical schools and what we believed. I was there. I believed it as well. It took a hell of a lot of time and study for me to understand that those messages were not actually helpful and they were incorrect. And this was very uncomfortable time in my life to work through that. But that's not a discussion. But I just want to say, we're talking about the pharma industry and what they're doing with HRTs. But, we need to consider two other factors. And this is that in Western society, because this is a Western society-driven thing, and the Western society driving this has got a very patriarchal view about women. Women is seen not as the wise women, the important function postmenopausal. They're just seen as being old and irritable. They're not so desirable any longer. And the husband is looking for a younger model. So, many people may remember in 1966, there was a book published, Feminine Forever, by one Robert Wilson. It was a bestseller. And this book told women to, they need to eliminate all these emotional things, associated complaints with menopause, and that husbands should send their irritable wives to the doctor so that they can get some estrogen, and it's the fountain of youth. Maybe they will save their marriages, right? So we have this patriarchal view, and it's still prevalent today. Even we think we're very liberated in Western societies. We're still suffering from that. We need to think about that. And then the medical profession was completely complicit. Yes, let's describe, give a prescription for HRTs. But as you explained, Sue, how are those HRTs that your GP wants to put you on going to help your insulin levels. It's not.
Mm.
So you'll please your doctor by taking it. What
But
is it going to do for you and your health?
how many doctors test insulin levels? You know,
Well, I can tell you here in the UK, almost nobody.
no, over here, you have to pay for it. I ask all my clients to have their insulin tested. I get letters from the Ministry of Health telling me to please stop doing this because it's an absolutely useless marker. And people go along and they have to pay for it. It's not, I don't think it's that expensive. I was talking to someone yesterday and she said, oh, she's a pharmacist, and she said, you know, it's so expensive to get insulin tested. You know, it's $40 a test. And it's like, well,
That's absolutely nothing. Well,
you know, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
No, it's not about that. That's an excuse, Sue. But the thing is, you know, there's another thing that people can do that they don't have to pay anything for to diagnose insulin resistance. So you can do it at home. If you want to know if you're insulin resistant, just take a tape measure, measure your waist and measure your height.
Yeah.
Okay. And you divide your waist by your height measurement. And if it's more than 0.5, you've got extra fat deposits in your abdomen. And that's a good indication that you're insulin resistant. So if you don't want to go and fight with the medical community to try to get an insulin test, or the government, or the guidelines, because they don't understand, they don't know, but they're advising the public. So my message here is start thinking for yourself. Think about if all these medicines that you get and being prescribed, is that making your life better? Are you feeling less moody? Are you having a brilliant night's sleep now? You know, have all these symptoms that you suffer from evaporated, and are you losing weight? I can tell you that for most of those, the answer is no. But I will make one little concession here, and I need to put this, I'm not saying all estrogen therapy is bad. There is a condition, and we know, you know, as women get older, they lose vaginal elasticity, and the vagina gets thinner, and it's also a cause of urinary tract infections and also repeated urinary tract infections. And it can be a very debilitating condition for older women. And in those circumstances, localized estrogen therapy, either as a gel or as a tablet inserted in the vagina, can be very helpful. So there are certain conditions that may benefit from it, but it's very different from the HRT therapy that we're talking about.
Mm. And I just want to mention, you know, we're talking about women again, but again, men fall into this category as well. And now they're getting testosterone therapy to deal with. And so,
well, I think it was a great brainwave from the pharma industry, because they could only sell HRT to 50% of the population. Now they've got the other 50% who's suffering from the same condition of insulin resistance, and lo and behold, they can now give them testosterone. So this is just getting worse and worse. And that's why, Sue, I think what you're doing is we're trying to, all of us, educate the public and ask them to start thinking for themselves.
yes. Mm. All right.
I think that's I've spoken enough. I think that's basically all the things I thought about, what's driving what we're seeing today.
All right. Well, before I close the slideshow, I popped an extra slide up here because I just wanted to let everybody who hasn't already bought Estrelita and Izzy's book, Eat Well or Die Slowly. I just wanted you to to be able to get a screenshot or go and search that out, because it's a fabulous book and I highly recommend it. So it's really worthwhile buying. All right, I'll stop the screen share. Well, we've been going for quite a while, so perhaps we could, I've got some other questions about HRT and things like that, but perhaps we could pick them up in part 2, because I think people have got a lot to think about after this session, Estrelita. It was wonderfully done. Thank you very much. So very clear and concise, and it just made such logical sense, you know, and to summarize, really what we're saying is that you get all these symptoms as you're aging, and we are being conditioned to be told that those symptoms are due to the menopause, or now for men, andropause. And if we go back and look at them, we can see that when those symptoms start occurring, I often get my clients to do that. Well, when did you first start having sleep problems? Oh, gosh, you were in your late 20s or early 30s. You know, when did you start struggling with weight? About the same time. So we can see that they have been accumulating, but suddenly they come together as like this cluster, and then we give them this name of perimenopause or menopause. And so what Estrelita has laid out for us so beautifully is how they cross, you know, the same symptoms of insulin resistance are what you're experiencing when you're saying you're experiencing menopause symptoms. So yeah, well worth giving that some thought. Do you want to just sort of finish up there on?
Yeah, well, I can just say thank you very much again, Sue, for the opportunity. It was delightful as always to chat to you, and I hope that this makes women think, because we need to empower women and men, because we're being lied to, but you know, this is not something that's going to change quickly. So it needs to come from people themselves that start thinking for themselves, look at data, look at what's going on, be critical, think about what you're doing, what you're eating, and the medication that you're taking. You know, are these things really helping you? And I understand it's difficult. It's very difficult to change your mind, adapt your mind. But it's absolutely critical if you want to live a healthy life. And I think the positive thing about this, Sue, is that all of us can do something about it. We can change what we eat. And there's people like you that help people understand what is the right kind of food to eat, so that you counter these symptoms and diseases that we see. It's epidemic proportions that's going on. So I just want to say thanks again, and it was really very nice having this chat with you.
Oh, thank you. It's always absolutely delightful. And like I said in the beginning, you know, when I want some information, you know, sometimes I email you, or, you know, I get your help and opinion on different things. So thank you very much.
Very welcome.
And we'll see you again in part 2.
Thank you.